Hello, this is Stephen Nojiri, and this is another Tada Genji tradition video. This video is part of the Refining Concepts theme for 2025, and it's going to be about Anatman and Shunyata. So Anatman is not self, Shunyata is emptiness. So in the Refining Concepts theme, we're going to look at specific documents, Kusunoki, Fukushima, Gengundan, Tada, Genji, etc. We're going to pick out terms and really look at them in depth. But before I start this video, I have to say that this particular video to some people, might come off as a religious and or political video. And please understand that there's nothing in this video that's meant to attempt to convert anyone, nor is there anything in this video meant to be hostile towards any particular group. I'm just saying this because this video is going to have to address some topics that, in order to clarify the terms that are the focus of the video, we're going to have to address these topics just simply because there's a complex political and cultural dynamic that does impact many of the modern day Western person's understandings of some of these terms. And these misunderstandings, and more importantly, the why of the misunderstandings and the impact of these misunderstandings, we have to approach and discuss this first in order to clear away the way for a more accurate, albeit it will be simple and introductory, understanding and look at these two terms. Okay, so first, before we do anything, let's actually look at the document that we're going to be pulling the term from. So the term today is the principle of emptiness, and we have to discuss Anatman and emptiness in order to give this accurate, clear introduction to the term principle of emptiness. Okay, so look at your screen. The term principle of emptiness comes from this document. It is the Fukushima Ryu Shinobi no Maki. It is the final part of the Shinobi no Maki, which is the scroll of refining intention. And so you'll see on the screen, this is the section. I've talked about the scroll of refining intention a lot. Here you go. Here's a picture. You see my hands. I'm holding it. Let's put some arrows up on the screen so it'll be easier to actually point out the terms. All right, so you will see the scroll of refining intention is this section, and the red arrow with the red circle around it. That is the term that we're going to focus on today. That is the principle of emptiness. So this is going to be a very long video. It's going to be kind of complicated. I don't know how many people will actually make it to the end, but I'm going to go through the whole thing because that's what I've said I'm going to do. But everything that we're going to do in this video today is going to come from that term right there in red. And also important to note is the section in green where it says this scroll is about the root of shinobi. That will come up later. So I'm going to discuss not only the principle of emptiness, but how the part in red relates directly to the part in green. And just for fun, you see Nojiri Jiroyamon's signature over there in the sort of purple, and this scroll is actually the Murakami scroll. I talked about that in Sacred Conspiracy. There's the Terazawa scroll that is in the National Archives, and then this scroll is the Murakami scroll. So you can see a signature in the stamp. Well, you can't really see the stamp because it's rolled up. But anyway, so that's kind of like to prove that this is the Murakami scroll. And then in the blue, there are two other places that we're going to address in a future video. So, but for this video, we're focusing on the red and the green. And so before I begin, let's take a layout of the rest of the video. It's going to be long. It's going to probably seem overly complicated to some. Again, we'll see how many people get to the end of it. But here's the layout. The first part is going to be addressing misconceptions. We have to, because a lot of people are going to have a difficulty applying what I'm trying to say because they're going to try to apply it in regards to previous misconceptions. So we're going to have to point out what the misconceptions are, how they came to be, how they're wrong, and try to correct that perspective. Then we're going to do a basic introduction to address Anatman and Shunyata within Buddhism. And then I'm going to try to explain to you how to place that, how to relate that information into the Fukushima Ryu scroll. What may have been Nojiri Jiroyamon's intentions? What were the implications and the meanings of the presence of the term? So In order to have a better idea of what Jiroemon was intending and meaning and what was in his head and what the implications are of the principle of emptiness, we have to understand at least the fundamentals of what is the principle of emptiness. And in order to understand it, we also have to understand what is Anatman. And we don't have to understand them to deep, complex, esoteric ways. We need just at least fundamentally a basic fundamental understanding that is correct and free of misconceptions. Make sense? All right, let's proceed. All right, so again, a bit of a disclaimer. The following slides may initially seem like I'm attacking a particular Buddhist tradition, the Theravadins, but let me stress that I am not attacking nor criticizing the Theravadins. As some of you know, and if you don't know, now you do, I'm a devoted Buddhist practitioner. I respect and honor all of the Sangha. I respect and pay honor to my Theravadin brothers and sisters. This is not an attack or criticism of the Theravada. However, since their tradition was the one that was very hijacked by Europeans with agendas in the 1800s and the early 1900s, I'm going to have to end up referencing and talking about the Theravadins by necessity. So my actual target is the crafted misconceptions of the 1800s and the 1900s, such as the Theravada Pali Canon, the myth that the Theravada Pali Canon is the original real Buddhism. Now, that's a myth. And these myths were essentially crafted basically by Europeans with agendas in the 1800s and in the early 1900s. So I'm not attacking the Theravadins, but I have to mention them because this is where a lot of the myths came from. Not the Theravadins, but the sort of European meddling in the 1800s. All right, so the first misconception that we're going to have to tackle is a big one, and it is widespread. And it is the myth that Theravada Buddhism is the only real Buddhism, that it's the oldest form of Buddhism, it's the only real Buddhism, all other Buddhism, all other Mahayana Buddhism is made up and doesn't count. And therefore, when talking about Buddhism, you can only use Theravada Buddhism. Right? That's the myth, and that's widely propagated. It is purely a myth, though. First off, it doesn't properly understand Buddhist history at all. It doesn't understand the history of Sri Lanka as a country, and it definitely misunderstands what the word Mahayana means. And again, ultimately, it's just a myth. So there are modern day academics who study Buddhism as their core academic object of study. You should go read their doctoral theses and their academic peer-reviewed journals and stuff. They're if you really want this information in detail. I will just give it to you in summation. But essentially, the myth of Theravada being the oldest school, etc., it's two parts. So the first part is, in Sri Lanka in the 1100s, Theravada was actually three different schools: Mahavihara, Abhayagiri, and the Jetavana school. All three of these schools practice what is quote-unquote Mahayana. They practice Vajrayana. There was Tantra. There was esoteric rituals, magic, all of that. Yes, that in the 1100s, in the first part of the 1100s, the Theravadins were doing Mahayana and they were doing magic and esoteric Buddhism. There was only a portion, a small, like half of the Mahavihara school decided that they wanted to redact a lot of things, to drop a lot of things, and go and form what they believed to be a very conservative view of Buddhism. And in the mid 1150s, they got the support of the king, the emperor of Sri Lanka, and he purged everybody that didn't match. Everybody who wasn't part of the conservative branch of the Mahavihara was purged. They were disrobed. You couldn't be a Buddhist practitioner from that point on unless you joined the conservative branch of the Mahavihara. So two schools were completely lost, closed forever, and the Mahavihara converted down to being a very conservative school. From that point on, so the first part of the myth is the idea that their conservative version of Buddhism is somehow the original Buddhism. It's not. It's not. It's their conservative view. That doesn't mean that it's the original. Now, but this myth that the Theravada conservative view is the original form of Buddhism, that myth was born in the 1800s and the 1900s, formed and fueled and constructed by British academics who, for their own personal reasons, wanted Buddhism to be redesigned into a form of philosophy and psychology, but not religious. And this push to make Buddhism into psychology, or push to make Buddhism into philosophy only and not religion, is still alive today. There's still people in 2025 that are pushing for a form of Buddhism that is not religious at all. Like, this push is still taking place to this day. So anyway, but this is where the myth that the Theravada is the real school and Mahayana is made up, that myth comes from those British, and it was also French too, because the French passed laws in certain countries saying Theravadins had to be like non-magical. Anyway, if you want to know more about the European meddling in the 1800s and 1900s, feel free to look it up. But that's where the myth comes from. So misconception number 2 is related to misconception number 1, and there are actually some really interesting peer-reviewed journals and doctoral theses, etc., from modern-day academics explaining this topic, about how this myth was born from British scholars in the late 1800s, manipulating the history and basically just misrepresenting the history to form this myth. And that myth is simply that the Theravada school goes back to the Buddha. It's the original school. And that the Pali canon is the only existing canon, or that it's the oldest known canon. Both of these, again, like I said, they're myths based on European meddling. And so, just to be blunt, there are actually 3 canon. There's 3 distinct Vinayas. There's the Pali Vinaya, there's the Mulasarvastivada Vinaya, and there's the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya. Right, as of now, pretty much the only school that uses the Pali or Theravadan Vinaya is the Theravadins, right? Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Thailand. They're the yellow orange robes. Then the Mulasarvastivada Vinaya is red crimson robes. You find it in northern India, Tibet, Bhutan. Persia used to have it when Persia was Buddhist, etc., etc. Then you have the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya, which is like China, Japan, Korea. Think of Chan, Zen. That's Dharmaguptaka Vinaya, blue, black. The Shingon school is now Dharmaguptaka Vinaya, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that in the very beginning, Shingon was actually Mulasarvastivada Vinaya. There's been some very interesting research done on the fact that the school appears to have originally been Mulasarvastivada Vinaya, but at some point was changed to the Dharmaguptaka Vinaya. But that's for a different video. But anyway, addressing the idea of the Theravada school going back to Buddha, no, it's the Theravada, as we already said, was a collective of schools, and now there's only one school left, so it's called Theravada. Those schools are branches of earlier schools, and then those schools that they are born from were born from even earlier schools, right? So, I mean, yeah, you can say that the Theravada can trace itself back to Buddha if you count it going through a successive lineage of predecessor schools. Sure. But the truth is, every single school can be said to trace back to Buddha if you trace it through a series of predecessor schools. There's no school that goes directly back to Buddha without going through predecessor schools. Every school is the result of a series of predecessor schools. Every school. So they claim that Theravada is exactly what Buddha taught, like Buddha started the Theravada himself. No, that's just a myth. There's also, to continue that sort of misconception, there's the misconception, again, Theravada has the oldest teachings, and that everything else is Mahayana, and then that was all made up somewhere generically around 500 AD, right? Generically. Now see the screen in red. This is also a myth. Both Buddhist scholars and modern-day early Buddhist academics who are actively studying ancient Buddhism as their object of study and writing doctoral theses on and peer-reviewed journals on, okay? And they focus on Buddhism from BC times, like within 100, 200, 300 years of Buddha's passing, before AD. Okay, both of these groups Buddhist scholars and academic scholars. Both of us resoundingly say that that is a myth. The current data actually suggest that the oldest teachings of Buddhism from BC times actually resembles the Mahayana doctrine much more than quote-unquote Hinayana doctrine. So, for example, the idea of a bodhisattva exists in BC times. You will find a lot of people that try to tell you the idea of a bodhisattva was made up in the Mahayana around 500 AD. This is a myth. This is just misinformation. It's not true. The bodhisattva ideal exists in BC times. And the idea, another thing, is a lot of people tell you, early Buddhists believed that Siddhartha was just a normal human being and he achieved enlightenment. And the idea that he was already enlightened and came to sort of, and appeared in the world to present himself as a teacher, that's made up by the Mahayana around 500 AD. But that is also not true, because the idea that Buddha was already an enlightened being, that idea is actually now found to exist in the oldest known Buddhist evidence. So what I'm trying to tell you is that if you talk to Buddhist scholars, or if you look at the most recent, the most current research, because I don't have the time to go into details, but if you are interested, please research early Buddhist research. Focus on peer-reviewed academic works, academic articles, doctoral theses of the most current research. You will see that the most current research shows that the earliest known Buddhist teachings are very similar to the Mahayana doctrine. And so therefore, even though the Mahayana doctrine, which we'll get into what that really means soon, even though Mahayana appears in the AD times, the ideas, the teachings, the beliefs that are in Mahayana exist in Buddhism in BC times. All right, so let's keep misconception 2 going. This idea of Hinayana versus Mahayana, old versus new. So as I've already said, this is wrong, and I'll try to keep it simple. There's only one definition of Hinayana, and that means that the practitioner is focused only on themselves and with no concern for others. There's actually 2 uses of the word Mahayana, and you, the viewer, would do well to understand these. Mahayana can refer to the Bodhisattva yana, or it can refer to a tradition of documents written in AD times. So when people talk about the Mahayana documents, the Mahayana text, they're referring to the tradition of any of the documents that were written after the original Vinayas were written. So remember I tell you there's those 3 Vinayas? They're written early on, and then a time passes, and then another collection of documents gets written in the AD times. That is referred to as the Mahayana doctrine, the Mahayana documents. But it's not synonymous with the Bodhisattva yana, or Mahayana, as the idea of the practitioner being concerned for the welfare of all beings. So you need to be able to distinguish between Mahayana as a tradition of writings versus Bodhisattva yana. And I want you to look in red, okay? Rejection of the textual Mahayana by traditions such as the post-1150s Theravada does not automatically mean a rejection of the Bodhisattva yana concepts. Much of the material in the Mahayana textual tradition comes from pre-existing, since BC times, teachings. So let me again explain that. The Bodhisattva yana teachings are found in BC times. They predate the Mahayana documents by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Okay? So even schools that may reject some or all of the Mahayana documents oftentimes still have Bodhisattva Yana teachings within their school. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so now that we've addressed some of those misconceptions, and hopefully, if you, the viewer, had any of those misconceptions, hopefully at least now you're willing to investigate them further. So you're saying, oh, hey, Nojiri just basically said that something I believe isn't accurate. I don't expect you to just believe me, but and I would actually don't want you to just believe me blindly. But what I'm hoping is that if I did call out something that you believe is true, I would hope that you would at least take the time to then consider my words and research the things that I said to go research. If you hold any of those misconceptions to be true, I challenge you to go do the research and challenge those conceptions. Test them. See if they hold up against scrutiny. But for the rest of us now, we're going to move forward. So now that we've done the misconceptions, we're going to look at correct perspectives. So, like as many of you know, I consider myself at least a devoted Buddhist practitioner with an authentic lineage, and I have a guru, I have a master, I have all kinds of vows and initiations, etc., 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 etc. Okay, but I'm not going to try to tell you that what is right in my opinion. I'm not going to try to tell you, oh, well, this is exactly how my school explains it, so this is what... No, I'm not going to do any of that. What I'm going to do is suggest that you utilize the following perspective, and that is that there is a lot about Buddhism that has been misrepresented and misunderstood in the West. Early Europeans had a specific desire and want concerning Buddhism, and they pushed their personal beliefs and agendas into their writings. They also layered on top of pre-existing political and cultural misunderstandings to create some really thick myths that have been gunking up a proper understanding of Buddhism in the West for a long time. The West still has a lot to learn about what Buddhism actually teaches and the history of the religion and the history and specific teachings of the various schools. Furthermore, what is most critical to understanding the samurai scrolls is to not overlay these political myths onto the samurai authors. We must only look at how the actual author would have believed or conceived of the terms. It is irrelevant how someone in another country or another time would have seen the terms. In other words, it doesn't matter how the Theravadins would explain it, because that's not how Nojiri Jiroemon would have understood it. It doesn't matter how Tibetans break Madhyamaka into Prasangika Madhyamaka and whatever, the two different types of Madhyamaka. Is irrelevant, because Nojiri Jiroemon wouldn't have known that, right? So the critical perspective is, regardless of one's personal beliefs or one's personal religious training, none of that really matters. The question is, how would Nojiri Jiroemon have understood the term? And so what we got to do is we just have to at least have a basic understanding of the terms that applies across the board, so that we know that there's a high probability that at least these fundamental understandings would have been in his mind stream.